to get, there's all sorts of rules, and they design the rules with one idea in mind, and that is to favor the incumbent. In the last three congressional cycles, there have been 1,200 contested congressional primaries. The total number of incumbents who lost was 8. That's the leverage point. That's the small gear in the clock that if we turn, we can affect tremendous change. Now, how we do that, I'm going to talk a little bit about the strategy, but that is a really, really important insight into how we can change our political system. The second important problem that we found is a surprise to no one here, and that is that the scale of the federal government is too large. Yeah. Thanks, buddy. So, I mean, this is a sort of a blinding glimpse of the obvious, I realize, but from, again, in the 19th century, if you look at the federal expenditures as a percentage of gross domestic product, so the total amount that the government spent of all the economic activity, it fluctuated between 1 and 4%. Okay? During wartime, it would spike up, but then it would come back down. Now, why would it come back down? It came back down largely because private entities controlled political parties. The government didn't control political parties. Private entities controlled the parties, and the parties controlled the politicians. So while the spending might go up during wartime, the private entities would get together and say, we've got to get it back under control, we got to lower taxes, and this is what happened, right? There was an income tax that was established during the Civil War. After the Civil War, it was repealed. And it was only reinstituted later as a part of the progressive era reforms. So this critical loop was broken where the private interests, private parties, people like us, controlled the political parties, and the political parties controlled the politicians. And that meant that the scope of government could be constrained. During a period from 1890 to 1920, there was a dramatic change. We went through a sort of big update to our operating system, right? We switched from Windows XP to Windows Vista, right? Yeah, the few computer geeks out there like me. So, major upgrade. This was driven by the progressive era, 1890 to 1920. Part of those progressive era reforms were changes to basically make it harder to get rid of incumbents. Then you had a seniority system that rewarded being reelected more often, and the more power that you got through the seniority process, the more goodies you could dispense, and therefore collect more campaign contributions and make it easier to get reelected. Now, this is a nice virtuous cycle, except for one problem, the spending part. And during this period, from 1880 until the post-war period, if you strip out the wartime expenses, the percentage in federal spending as a percentage of the total economy grew from that 1 to 4% range to 20 to 25%. Right now, it is at a non-wartime high in the history of the United States, just above 25%. We are spending more as a percentage of GDP now than at the peak of World War I. And there's no end in sight. So we have got to find a way to constrain the size of the federal government. The third piece of this is the insight that the problem is not the politicians. Now that sounds really bizarre, right? But I will posit that you could take all 535 people in Washington right now, replace them completely with 535 new people, and within a month, we'd be back to where we started. And the reason is the incentives are all screwed up, right? You put people in a situation where you have to be heroic to constrain the size of government, and there are not enough heroes to go around. You might have 10% heroes. You may elect one of those heroes right here, but he'll be in the minority. you have to change the incentive structure to make it in the interest of someone to shrink the size of government, the federal government. Now, let me hasten to add here, I am not actually anti-government, right? There's an optimum, right? If the government gets too big, which is where we are now, that's bad. But let me tell you, if the government becomes totally dominated by private interests and business people, we have Mexico. We don't want that. Rule of law is what the United States is based on. And the law, it comes from the government, and that comes from the people. So we need the government. But crucially, we need the government to do our bidding. So how are we going to accomplish this? Seems, again, like a hopeless task, but it's not. Following the Constitution, that would be a great start, yes. And I think the key is to make it in their interest to follow the Constitution. And then they will. Right now, it's not in their interest to follow the Constitution, and so they don't. So the first thing that we are doing in this group, Citizen Leader Alliance, is that we're going to reassert private control over the electoral process. And we're going to do that by going after the most vulnerable spot, and that's primaries. Primary turnout is unbelievably low. The runoff election, which just happened, turnout was about 5%. Now that's terrible news in terms of political participation, but it's an opportunity. If we organize and we find candidates that we want to support in a primary, a few hundred votes can often swing the difference. There are about 20 House of Representative seats that are in competitive, naturally competitive districts in the state of Texas. Right? Those are decided by less than 2,000 votes. It is an easy thing to do if we get organized to change that. And if we don't even have to win all of those, if we unseat a handful of incumbents who are in the way, the message is received. They may resist it, but when they find out they could lose their job because we're organized to put them out of a job, they will react, and they will begin to be accountable to the people again. The key is the primary. Now, this was sort of, again, obvious maybe to people who are involved in politics. I wasn't involved in politics. I've never voted in a primary. I've never voted in a primary. I feel like an idiot once I found this out. There are some, including my kids, who think I'm an idiot anyway. But this reinforced that notion. Right? But my point here is that as you're thinking about organizing locally, focus on the primaries. That's the soft underbelly of the system. Okay? What we're doing in the Citizen Leader Alliance is we have a series of activities that basically mimic what parties do, but it is not a political party. Right? We are recruiting candidates, many of them coming from Tea Parties. Right? We've had a group on the ground over the last 9 months in Texas, going to events like this as well as others, and have been recruiting candidates to run in political races. We're going to continue that. We got a late start this cycle. The real test will be in 2012 anyway. I've likened 2010 election to being the Battle of Britain. 2012 is Normandy. We have to win 2012. So in addition to recruiting candidates, we're training them. If you're interested in political office, right, if you think you could be effective, go to one of our training sessions. We teamed up with a group called American Majority. American Majority, you can just find just Google them, and they will come up. They have regular training for both activists like yourselves who may not want to run in political office, and then people who think they might. Look into it. They are terrific training sessions. We are also doing campaign support. We're helping campaigns that support the principles we support. There's a whole wide variety